Hello everyone, welcome back to class. Today we are continuing on in our third unit, looking at some ethical issues and dilemmas. And today we're going to be investigating the second topic that y'all voted on, which is euthanasia and assisted suicide, or as we'll see what these authors call it, assisted dying. So I'm asking y'all to read an article written by Fontalis et al., named Euthanasia and Assisted Dying, What is the Current Position, and What are the Key Arguments Forming the Debate? This article tries to provide an overview of the ethics of euthanasia and assisted suicide. And it also tries to provide something of an analysis of its legality and some of the principles that are informing the debate that healthcare providers and thinkers and bioethicists are having today. So that's what we're going to be looking at in this lecture. I'm going to start off by giving you some general notes. Then we'll go over some important definitions relevant to this debate, talk about the legality of these practices, and then finally we'll end by looking at some arguments for euthanasia and assisted dying and some arguments against it. All right, let's begin. To start off, Fontalis et al. Basically discuss how euthanasia and assisted dying today remains a hot topic in bioethics and society at large. They note how this is a very complex moral issue that has implications for legality and medical practice today. So one of the things that we might want to do at the get-go is distinguish between whether or not euthanasia and assisted dying is moral and whether or not it should be legal or illegal. Generally, we think that these things go together, but they are two very different things. Sometimes something can be moral and illegal. Sometimes something can be legal and immoral. Their goal in this piece is to, quote, provide an analytic framework of the current position and the main arguments related to the rights and moral principles concerning assisted dying. So, as this is a medical practice that seems to be gaining a little bit of steam around the world, it is a discussion that I think is worthy of being had, one that we ought to consider, especially if we're going to be working some sort of job that is involved in healthcare management or clinical practice at all. So that's why we're looking at it in this class. As you'll see, there are a lot of different arguments that we could bring to bear on this debate. Arguments for euthanasia and assisted dying, and arguments against it. But first, what exactly are we talking about in this debate? Because there are a bunch of different ways that this could go down in practice. The authors provide 4 different definitions for us that distinguish between euthanasia and physician-assisted dying and how these might be voluntary, involuntary, or non-voluntary. First, let's look at voluntary active euthanasia. They define voluntary active euthanasia as follows. The act of a physician or third person intentionally ending a person's life, usually through the administration of some drug, at that person's voluntary and competent request. So, voluntary active euthanasia involves a physician or third person intentionally ending a patient's life that they voluntarily and competently request. In other words, you have a patient who has some sort of wish or desire to die. They request that they be euthanized, and they are competent when they make this request, and the request is carried out by a physician or a member of the care team, usually through the administration of some drug. So something enters into their body intravenously, or perhaps they are given some sort of other cocktail to ingest. Voluntary active euthanasia, then, is voluntarily and competently requested by the patient. We can contrast this with non-voluntary euthanasia. Non-voluntary euthanasia is defined as follows: the act of a physician or third person intentionally ending a person's life, usually through the administration of some drug, without the person's consent. So, in voluntary active euthanasia, the person has voluntarily requested that this be done. In non-voluntary euthanasia, the person has not given their consent of this. That does not necessarily mean, though, it's against the patient's wishes or will. It just means that they haven't clearly given their consent to undergo this process. So, this is what's known as non-voluntary euthanasia. A physician gives a patient usually some sort of drug cocktail that ends their life, but it's done so without their consent. We may further distinguish these two types of euthanasia from involuntary euthanasia. Involuntary euthanasia is the act of a physician or third person intentionally ending a person's life, usually through the administration of some drug, against the patient's will. So, in voluntary euthanasia, the person requests it competently, voluntarily. In non-voluntary euthanasia, it's done without their consent. In involuntary euthanasia, it's done against their will. So this is something that the patient doesn't want done. They have not requested it. Perhaps they've even said that they don't want it, but yet it's done to them. In all of these cases, a physician or a third person ends the patient's life, kills them, essentially. But whether or not this is justifiable, we seem to base on whether or not the patient requests it, whether or not their request is competent, and whether or not it goes against their will. So, involuntary euthanasia, basically, some people might think, it is morally equivalent to murder because the person is killed and it goes against their will. They don't want this done. But what binds all of these different kinds of euthanasia together is that a physician or third person intentionally ends a patient's life. We can contrast euthanasia then with physician-assisted suicide, or as the authors call it, physician-assisted dying. This is defined as the act of a physician or third person intentionally helping a person to terminate their own life, usually by providing drugs for them for self-administration, at that person's voluntary and competent request. So, in euthanasia, somebody ends a patient's life. In physician-assisted dying, somebody helps a patient end their own life. This is why it used to be called physician-assisted suicide, because a nurse or a physician or doctor would give the drugs to the patient who would then consume them themselves. So, to summarize, euthanasia involves a person other than the patient ending their life. Physician-assisted dying involves the patient ending their own life. Whether or not we think this practice is moral is something that we'll consider later in the lecture, but in part it's going to be based on whether or not this goes against the patient's will, whether or not they have consented to it, and whether or not they have voluntarily and competently requested it. Just keep that stuff in the back of your mind. So those are the different kinds of euthanasia and assisted dying. While we do have some helpful definitions that can help frame this debate, this isn't a practice that is legal everywhere. In fact, we might say that this practice is illegal in more places than it is legal, depending on which kind of euthanasia or assisted dying you're looking at. The authors note that as of 2018, only a few countries had legalized variants of euthanasia and assisted dying. Countries like the Netherlands, Belgium, Switzerland, Luxembourg, Canada, and Colombia, and then a few isolated states in the US, like Oregon, Washington, Montana, Vermont, California, Colorado, and Washington, D.C. So, as of 2018, those were the only places that had legalized variants of euthanasia and assisted dying. In other places, assisted death remains a criminal offense liable to prosecution. So it is not something that is actually legal. And if a doctor helps a patient or ends a patient's life, they could be liable to prosecution because they've done something that's illegal. This is a debate that is still being had in Eastern and Western countries. And so I think that's one of the reasons why we should be discussing it in this class, or at least thinking about it, insofar as we have jobs in this industry, or will have them. The important point to note about this section is that this is still a hotly debated thing. It's not something that is legal everywhere, and as we'll see, it's not something that many people think is actually moral to do in the first place. But we'll get into that in a moment. The authors try to contextualize this debate by summarizing again the 4 principles of bioethics that we've already looked at. If we want to figure out whether or not this practice is moral or immoral, and if it should be legal or illegal, we might want to consider whether or not it is compatible with the 4 principles: autonomy, justice, non-maleficence, and beneficence. Remember, autonomy has to do with self-determination in regards to one's life. Justice has to do with fair and equal treatment, and more specifically, fair and equal distribution of the risks and benefits of medical practice. Beneficence has to do with treatment according to the best interest of the patient, doing good for them and to them. And non-maleficence has to do with doing no harm to our patients. Some people think that euthanasia violates the principle of non-maleficence. And so on those grounds, it is something that is immoral and should be illegal. But as we'll see, healthcare practitioners disagree about how to adhere to these 4 principles, and whether or not euthanasia and assisted dying is compatible with them. In the non-maleficence case, we might ask, how exactly are we defining harm here? Does quality of life matter more than quantity of life? Could killing someone actually involve helping them? Doing something good for them? Well, that's something that we're going to consider. And we're going to do that by looking at various arguments now for and against euthanasia and assisted dying. First, we'll start by looking at arguments for it. One of the arguments that Fontalis et al. Bring forth is the following. Individuals should have the right to make their own decision about when to end their life, especially if they are terminal, in great pain, to avoid an undignified death, or if living in some way undermines their personal identity. There are a few different ideas here. Insofar as people have a right to life, for example, we think this is a basic human right. Some thinkers argue that we should also have a right to end our own lives, or to have our own lives ended for us if we so wish. This is especially germane in cases in which somebody knows that they are going to die. For example, imagine you have a cancer patient and they know that they are going to die soon, but they don't want to wait until they start losing capacities or are in great pain or can't move and do things like they used to. Some people argue that terminal patients should be allowed to end their life if they so choose. We might also discuss cases in which patients are in great pain. Think of somebody who suffers from cluster headaches, or someone who has some sort of illness or disease that is really causing them a lot of pain, or psychologically some sort of illness or disorder that causes them a lot of suffering, anguish, and despair. In cases like this, where patients express that to go on living would be unbearable or simply not worth it, we hear people argue that they should have a right to end their own life, because to go on living would be a net negative for them and maybe their family members. We might also bring up the idea that if somebody does have an illness or a disease that is degenerative, if it won't allow them to live the kind of self-sufficient, dignified life that they currently do, then they might be given the ability to end their own life, or the right to end their own life, because they want to avoid some sort of undignified death. Finally, there are a bunch of different activities or practices that are meaningful to individuals, things that they can't see their life being without. One might also argue that individuals who are facing the end of their lives should be allowed to end their own lives if letting nature take its course would cause them to live in a way that undermines their personal identity and sense of self. All of these kind of arguments are related to the idea that quality of life matters more than quantity of life. And this is worth considering. Would it be better to live a high quality, shorter life, or a low quality, longer life? As individuals see the end of their lives approaching, many of them wish to make the most out of that time that they can, rather than wither away. So, this is an important consideration. Does life intrinsically have value, whether or not the person is suffering or happy? Or does quality of life matter? And does quality of life matter more than quantity? Secondly, these arguments lean on the idea that each person should be the sole arbiter of their own life and death. The general idea being that, look, people own their bodies in some sense, and so they should be given the right and the freedom to do what they want with their bodies, including taking their own life, if they so choose. All of these considerations we might lump under the first argument for euthanasia and assisted dying. The second argument that the authors consider involves the principle of beneficence and autonomy. Argument 2 goes like this. In some cases, killing a patient or letting them die is in their best interest and preserves their autonomy. And there are a bunch of different examples that we could connect to this, including some of the ones that we've already mentioned. For example, if you have a patient that is terminal, killing them or letting them die in some way allows them to exercise their autonomy. Insofar as individual autonomy is something that we care about and we want to protect, some thinkers argue that it should be safeguarded and we should allow individuals to exercise it, even if it means killing themselves. We could also imagine a situation in which somebody has some sort of psychological or physical ailment where prolonged treatment isn't going to help them. It isn't going to improve the situation. We might then ask again, what kind of quality of life do they have? Somebody who suffers immensely from cluster headaches or has such a deep depression that they no longer see the point in living and they feel as if they are a drain on their family members and on society, one might argue killing them or letting them die is in their best interest. This is something that is actually good for them. Finally, we might look at cases in which somebody, again, has a degenerative disease. For example, if somebody has MS or Alzheimer's disease or Parkinson's disease, or these kinds of ailments that get worse over time and strip individuals of their capacities, allowing them to kill themselves or to die safeguards their autonomy. It gives them a choice over, well, how they want the rest of their life to go, what they want it to look like. At some point, if a patient has a really serious degenerative disease, they might not be able to make that decision anymore, cognitively or physically follow through with it by administering some kind of medication to themselves. So autonomy is safeguarded by giving them this choice over their own death. Thus, argument 2 has to do with protecting, safeguarding, and allowing individuals to exercise their right to autonomy and bodily liberty. And it's argued in some cases, euthanizing a patient or letting them die is actually what's best for them, due to the considerations at play. Finally, we might look at one last argument for euthanasia and assisted dying. This one has to do with the dignity or the intrinsic worth of human beings. The argument goes like this. In some cases, killing a patient or letting them die is more dignified. It allows them to go out on their own terms with some sort of dignity and self-esteem intact. Think about cases in which, again, somebody has some sort of neurological or physically degenerative disease. If they get to the point in their life where they can no longer wipe their own butt or take care of themselves or do the activities that are meaningful to them, they might feel like they've lost some dignity, that their life has lost some value, that they no longer have the same self-esteem and self-worth that they did before. So the argument goes, we want to give people the ability to go out on their own terms, to live out the rest of their life in a dignified way in which people have a robust and meaningful sense of self-worth and personal identity. Thus, this argument is based in part on the idea that allowing euthanasia and assisted dying respects the intrinsic worth of individuals that they have for themselves. We might argue that degeneration is associated with embarrassment, loss of dignity, loss of self-esteem. Insofar as these things are related to people's happiness and their quality of life, we might put forth an argument that dignity matters and if euthanasia and assisted dying helps respect and safeguard people's dignity, then we might justify it on those grounds. Now, those were some arguments for euthanasia and assisted dying. The article also considers arguments against these practices, and these come in a lot of different forms. The first argument has to do with abuse of this practice, or troubling social and medical consequences that allowing or normalizing this practice might lead to. It goes like this. Permitting and or legalizing euthanasia and assisted dying may lead to a slippery slope of coercion, conflicts of interest, eugenicist attitudes and practices, the erosion of doctor-patient relationships, dissolution of trust in medical institutions, etc. So the general idea is that if we allow this practice and if we legalize it, that's going to produce a bunch of bad consequences. Consequences that are bad for individuals and society. We can quite easily, for example, imagine a situation in which if this practice becomes more widespread and legal, doctors and family members could use it for mischievous purposes. It is kind of a trope in television shows and movies, but you could imagine a family banding together to try to get rid of one of their relatives so that they could have their inheritance, right? So that they could have some money or wealth. You could imagine family members conspiring and having one of their older family members euthanized in order to speed that process along. You could imagine family members and doctors colluding together to bring about this situation. You could also imagine situations in which, if this was legal, doctors, family members, or other people could use it to blackmail older people, could use it to silence them. Basically, legalizing this practice would allow for its abuse. So that's a risk. That's something that we need to consider. The second implication of this argument is that permitting and or legalizing euthanasia and assisted dying may lead to eugenicist attitudes and practices. Think back to the article that we looked at last time regarding human genome editing. There are people in society who think that able-bodied people are better or have more value, that younger people are better and have more value. The worry is that if we allow this practice and if we legalize it, people might use it, abuse it, for eugenicist ends, and it might lead to the proliferation of eugenicist attitudes. Insofar as that's something that we don't want to accept and promote, we might worry about legalizing and normalizing euthanasia and assisted dying. Another worry that this argument gets at is that if this is legalized, people might lose trust in their personal doctor or their care team. Why? Well, having them euthanized is always an option, right? Giving a doctor or an institution that kind of power over you is a scary thing. And so patients might put their guards up. They might not go to the hospital as often as they should, or go to their checkups as often as they should, if they're worried in the back of their mind about being killed, as silly as that may be. So we're worried here about the erosion of doctor-patient relationships and people losing trust in medical institutions. If that happens, we might see people become more and more unhealthy. We might see some sort of health epidemic. Another thing that we might be concerned about is that this might lead people to question that their doctor or care team has their best interest at heart. So, this first argument basically tries to say that legalizing and normalizing euthanasia and assisted dying may lead to a bunch of bad social and individual consequences. The second argument that we're going to look at has to do with the value of human life and our place in the cosmos. The second argument goes like this: all life is sacred, and the sanctity of life prevails over all other values, regardless of a patient's wishes. Sometimes this is an argument that you'll see from institutions and people who are religiously minded. Christian, for example. This argument is based on the idea that life has some sort of intrinsic value and is inherently more valuable than non-existence. We might contrast this idea with what we investigated before, that the quality of life matters over the quantity of life. Someone might argue that while yes, that is somewhat true, quantity of life also really matters. And these people might bring another reason into the mix, which is our life is actually not our own. Somebody who believes in God, who believes in Catholicism, for example, will believe that God in some real way has brought them into this universe and is responsible for their existence. God is responsible for all of creation, and God is the ultimate arbiter of who lives and who dies and what people's lives look like, insofar as he is sovereign over all of the universe. Because God is at the top of the cosmic hierarchy, and he should be the one to have the final say in things, euthanasia and assisted dying could be seen as going against the will of God. That is, these people might argue that euthanasia and assisted dying is jumping the gun. It's not allowing God's will to carry itself to fruition. Another idea that this argument is associated with is that it might not be true that individual autonomy matters more than other communitarian and religious concerns. So the various arguments for euthanasia and assisted dying were trying to argue that people should have the right to basically do what they want with their lives, including ending them if they so choose. But this kind of view presupposes the liberal individualism, or the rights-based theory that we looked at. If you don't believe in that view, you might think that, look, there are community and public concerns that matter more than individual concerns. If you're a utilitarian, you might believe the same thing. So, individual autonomy is not as important as what the community or the family wants. So, if you have a family that doesn't want their grandmother to die, even though she's felt like she's lived a full life and she's ready to go, if the wishes and desires of the family or the wider social community matters more, maybe we should listen to them. We see this attitude, this disposition in some Eastern cultures and some Asian practice of Asian medical practice. In Japan, for instance, individual autonomy seems to matter less than the health of the individual and the concerns of the family and the wider community. So, this second argument, that life is sacred and that our life might not be our own, or at least we shouldn't be the sole arbiter of it, is brought to bear against euthanasia and assisted dying. Finally, we'll consider one more argument against it. This third argument goes as follows. Permitting and or legalizing euthanasia and assisted dying may put doctors and care teams into tricky ethical situations which violate their conscience. So, the worry here is that, look, euthanasia and assisted dying, this topic is something that people have varied intuitions and ideas about, varying views of right and wrong. If we legalize this practice, and if a bunch of hospitals and other clinics start engaging in it, we might have a situation on our hands in which doctors feel pressure to carry this out for people, even if that violates their conscience, even if they don't want to do it. Say, for example, they think it's against their religious beliefs, or if it's just against their ethical beliefs. Should doctors or physicians be required to carry this out for patients? Well, that's a tricky question. Thus, we might worry about this putting pressure on doctors in a way that stresses them out. We might also worry that legalization or normalization of this practice may lead doctors into being coerced into performing it. If the idea that the right to death is on the same level as the right to life, if that gains ground, then we might see a situation in which hospitals or these other institutions start mandating that their doctors and physicians engage in this practice. Thus, by law, we might worry that they'll be forced to carry these out, even if they don't want to. This kind of situation is intimately related to an experience that a lot of healthcare practitioners have, which is moral distress, which they feel as a result of seeing some sort of practice or treatment, or feeling that they have to carry it out themselves if they don't morally agree with it. So, this last argument states that this might put doctors into tricky ethical situations which put pressure and stress on them, and maybe which put legal pressure on them, depending on how far this gets normalized and how much the right to ending one's own life becomes valued in the near future. These are not all of the arguments for and against euthanasia and assisted dying, but I think it provides a pretty good survey. There are a bunch of considerations that are going to determine how you feel about this, if you think it should be legalized and if you think it should be practiced. One is, do you think there is a moral distinction between killing someone and letting them die? Say, for example, that somebody is hanging off a cliff right next to you, and you can save them. If you just walk by and let them die, is that morally equivalent to killing someone? Say, shooting someone in the head? How far does the moral principle of beneficence extend? Are we morally obligated to try to save people's lives, even if they feel like their lives aren't worth living? These are all important questions that you should reflect on. Second, should we grant individuals complete control over what they do and, well, what they do with their own body? Because euthanasia and assisted dying is related to this idea of autonomy, right? In a bunch of other situations, we place conditions on what people can and can't do with their lives. And we make moral judgments about the lives and decisions that people lead. For example, we could talk about abortion. If you think that a woman should be able to make up the decision of whether or not to have a child, to abort a fetus, then would it be morally inconsistent to deny them the right to end their own life if they so choose? Well, that's an interesting question. What about vaccination? Is it morally consistent to say that people must get a certain vaccine, but then also prevent them from carrying out some sort of decision regarding abortion? How far does this right to personal autonomy extend? We allow it in abortion cases, although not in every case. It depends on the state, right? There was a big hubbub recently due to COVID about vaccination and public health. Well, should we feel the same way about euthanasia and assisted dying? It would seem that lately we've been taking public health more seriously than individual autonomy. Are there good reasons for that? If so, what are they? And we might also ask, should individuals be given the right to completely control their own life, or are they beholden to some sort of standard or transcendent deity or some sort of transcendent value? Oftentimes what you'll hear from people, particularly in Catholic clinical settings, is that we are beholden to some objective standard of right and wrong, and we ought to follow the will of God. There is something above us on the cosmic hierarchy. How you feel about euthanasia and assisted dying is in part going to be informed by whether or not you believe God exists, whether or not you think this life on earth is all that there is, or if there's an afterlife, and what you think the morality of suicide is. If you think suicide is moral and immoral, and under what conditions. All of these things are related to basic metaphysical views of the nature of reality and how all this stuff works. Finally, we're also going to want to consider, does quality or quantity of life matter more? Should we try to give people a good death, or should we try to prolong life as much as we can? This is going to become an even more important question as we move on into the future and more technological advancements occur. There are already a lot of organizations and research occurring around aging and anti-aging technology. In the foreseeable future, our technology might be so good that we might be able to slow down aging or reverse it. And if science fiction is to be believed, we might reach a point in the future, in human society, where we will be able to extend our lives indefinitely by uploading our consciousness into computers or robots or other inorganic forms. So, what exactly does a good human life look like? Does a quality human life include death? Or is immortality preferable? Does a quality human life need to end with a quality human death? These are all important considerations. And I'll leave you with one more. If we do decide to legalize euthanasia and assisted dying, what exactly should that look like? What should the conditions be? Should we allow people to kill themselves or die only if they have a terminal physical illness? What about some sort of psychological ailment? Somebody who's really struggling with depression or anxiety? Should we allow somebody to kill themselves if they just have a form of agoraphobia or anxiety or bipolar? How about schizophrenia? Under what conditions would we allow somebody to undergo this? And who would we let undergo this? Just adults? Children? Teenagers? Only elderly people and or those with terminal ailments? These are all things that you should reflect on when trying to figure out whether or not you think this practice is moral and immoral, and if it should be legalized, what the conditions of that should be. It's one that we are going to have to continue to wrestle with as, well, human society changes and evolves, and as our technology gets better. Okay. Thank you all for listening. I hope you found this enjoyable and informative. I'm curious to see what y'all have to say. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time. Have a good one.